Good morning, Crest members. Today, our topic to talk about is initial inspection and scope of work. As you know, if you've seen the last production uh, video and PowerPoint presentation, we talked about equipment arrival. The first one was mobilization, then we talked about equipment arrival, and then after equipment arrival, we talked about equipment placement and setup. So now that we've got all that done, we need to go to the next progressive step on getting the production portion of the job started and get it complete. Now, keep in mind that some of these initial inspection steps have already started. You would have started that obviously when the phone rang, but it's time now to get them into place and to start to formalize that and to make sure that we cross our T's and dot our I's and that we don't miss any steps in the progress. We want to talk about the initial inspection. Hang on a minute. Rhonda, come here now. Want to talk about the initial inspection as to how we are going to start the inspection of the job and how we're going to get the job started on the inspection part. Sorry about that little pause there. A little bit about me. I think most of you have seen this in the other slides, just to show you a little about my background. If you're talking to some of your folks, you know a little bit about me, but serve on several committees. I've got a lot of the IICRC certifications. I'm on the technical advisory committee for the commercial drawing specialist, which that committee's not functional at the moment, and is sort of in a pause until the actual manual gets written for that, which has never been done. So still a good course to take. Just don't have a manual to go with it. But several of those things. So a little bit about some of the things that I've done in the past 40 years. So enough about that. Let's get started talking about the assessment of the job site. So now that we have equipment and personnel have arrived, you've already put together a plan, and we've decided what needs to get started first. And equipment's arrived, people have arrived, you've got equipment set, and you've got your people in place, and you're sort of like, what's next? How do we authorize this? How do we get things authorized that we need to do? How do we know what the plan is? A lot of times it'll be chaotic at first, and that's what we want to stop while we're going. You'll have 100 different team members going in 40 different directions. Nobody sort of knows what to do. Nobody knows where to go. And you need to be able to get your people focused and get folks moving all in the same direction instead of having a so-called Chinese fire drill, to where the fire drill is just run for your life. So we need to get everybody focused, get them on the same path and with the same goals. So you say, well, when I'm on a really chaotic job in the early stages, I've got a bunch of equipment here, I've got a bunch of people here. How do we get that done? So that's what we want to talk about and put together a plan for doing that. These jobs can run from as small as 20 people on a job site to as large as 400 or 500 people on a job site. So you've got to be ready to manage any number of people. What do I do now? I've got all these people here. They're going in different directions. You know, we got 3 people trying to do the same thing and nobody trying to do everything. So, you know, what do I do? How do I control that? So what we want to do is step back a little bit and let's put together a plan. A little bit of a football analogy. If you watch the playoffs to the game where the Titans won, I'm sorry, or lost, I'm sorry about that they didn't win. But you notice in the boxes at the top, you got a defensive coordinator, an offensive coordinator, a quarterback coordinator, a linebacker coordinator. You got all these people sitting around watching the game. They've all got headphones on, and they're all putting together a plan. They actually already have a plan. They're fine-tuning that plan as they go along. So keep that in mind, and let's remember that this plan that you put in place is not a concrete plan that you put in place as it would be if you're building a new building and you pre-planned this months and months in advance. You've worked out all the details. This thing is happening on the fly. It's happening as you go. The ball's been hiked. The quarterback has it in his hand, and he's got to figure out what to do with it. And in this case, if you're in charge, you're the quarterback. So let's put together a plan and figure out how to do that to make it work. First thing you want to start with is a checklist. You need a checklist for everything you do. If you go out and you're extracting water in Miss Jones's living room and bathroom where she had a toilet overflow, and you forget your extraction tool, your carpet wand or your extreme extractor, your water claw, or whatever it is you're using, it's not the end of the day. Okay, you run back and get it. You lost an hour. You're a little bit embarrassed, but you're going down the road. If you get on 50 or 100,000 square feet and you get out there with a bunch of property managers wanting to get open for business and you don't have it, it could be the end of your day and the end of that job for you. So you need a checklist. You need a checklist for everything you do. On the checklist, you need different things that are customized to your company, but you need task assignment forms, daily job progression forms, scopes of work, sketches, rebuild estimate if you're going to do rebuild, and recommendations maybe to the client if you're not doing rebuild if it's necessary. But you need a good checklist. Imagine a NASCAR team getting to the racetrack with their car hauler and their tools and their crews. And if you've ever been around NASCAR, the cars go in the attic of the hauler, so you can't see them. They're way up in the top. The elevators lift them up there. Can you imagine getting to the racetrack and getting ready to do that? And they lower that elevator and there's no car there because nobody forgot to load it. I know you've all got an employee called nobody that work at every business and every office because nobody ever does anything right. So you got to have a checklist to keep that from happening. Have a checklist for everything you do. There's never been a NASCAR race won, a Super Bowl won, or a business that stayed in business and won without checklists so you can double check. The very smartest of people that can run a large job will know that you cannot remember everything in the heat of the moment without a checklist to be able to go by. So make sure you've got a good checklist. Make sure it is a living checklist, saying that you have room at the bottom to write other things in. And if you write it in on one job, chances are you need to write it in on the permanent list for every job, because if you need it once, you'll probably need it again. Let's talk about task assignment forms. So you have a lot of tasks to do on a large loss job or on any commercial job. On a smaller job, you might have two people performing every task on the job. However, when you get on a large job to where you've got dozens of people or maybe hundreds of people, then you have to separate out these task assignments. So let's look at some of these on this form here, and this is a very small section of the form that you'll need. But who's going to take care of your production on these jobs? Who's going to do what? Now let me back up by saying this. If you're in charge and you're the main person there running production, your task needs to be zero. You don't need to have anything on the task that you are assigned to do. Your job will be busy enough managing the people who are doing the task. I know that's hard for owners sometimes to step back away from the job site and watch everybody and what they're doing without getting involved. Most of the time as owners, you're having to deal with every single task on the job. You're having to answer questions. You're having to make decisions. So don't get your head buried in the sand taking care of one particular item. That's why you want people assigned to do it. You want that written down, who's assigned to do it, And you want all your team members to know who they are. Do you really want the truck driver coming up to you and asking you where to put the diesel fuel? It's not something you need to be responsible with with putting up with at that moment. You need to have somebody assigned for diesel fuel. You'll notice on this particular form, we've got who's the senior project manager or the coordinator on the job. That's going to be performed by, it may be owner there. If in some of these categories, it may be ABC Restoration Company is going to handle it. It may be by an outside subcontractor that you don't have anything to do with. So that's why we have the column of who is it to be performed by. Is the owner taking responsibility for a particular item on the list? Does he have an electrical contractor that he's assigned to take responsibility? Is the fire department taking responsibility for portions of it? And so which company is performing that task is what that column is for. Your next column is the person responsible. So, okay, we know that ABC Fire and Water Damage Restoration is taking care of generator setup maybe. But then we want to know the person who's responsible for that. So that's John Jones is a person responsible. Then we want his cell phone number out there. So if people have a generator setup problem, they simply go to John Jones with their generator setup problem. They're not bothering the senior project manager. They're not interrupting the project managers or the health and safety people. They know exactly who to go to. So spread this form around each day once if you have any changes on it to make sure everybody, including the building owners or the management of the property, include them in this so they know who's responsible as well. You got a date and a day up there. That's for whatever the date and the day of the week is. Put that on there, and then if you have an update, update it and send it out via email. That's why you have the email column in the last over there. Now, emails are getting a little outdated in a lot of instances. Sometimes now people are going by different project communications. Sometimes people are going through different project management tasks that they've got, job docs and stuff like that. Hang on one second. And y'all stand by for a minute. I'm understanding we might have a technical difficulty on the slides moving. Back and see. All right, I understand we had a little technical difficulty with the slides not moving, so I'm going to back up a slide or two right quick and let you see some of the forms that we were talking about as they were not moving. Always something technical about this kind of stuff. So, yeah. All right, so zooming back through these we're talking about, and I'll do this real quick because we've already went through the verbal on it, but that's just a little about me and your people being chaotic, running all over the place from street to street. And Rhonda, if you'll check and make sure those are flipping through now on the presentation. And then, what do you do now? And the answer to that is let's put the plan together that we've talked about, and then having a checklist. I'll slow down a little bit here. Here's where the checklist is, to where you have the different checklists that we talked about. And stand by, understand they're still not flipping around. Okay. So we're on the checklist, where you have your checklist, and again, customize that to your company, and make sure that you've got that customized like you need to have that. So on your task assignment form that we went over that. So, and again, this is a short version of that. So have as many on the task assignment as you need to have. You'll have different things. You may have electricians on there. You may have a fencing company to set up safety barriers on there. So this list will be 1 or 2, maybe 3 pages long, depending on how many tasks that you've got. Now, your different people you've had this assigned to, such as the person in charge of, let's pick on desk and setup and monitoring. You've got Jimmy Smith in charge of that, maybe, and then Jimmy Smith may have his own task assignment report under that. So he may take 10 people that he's got working on deskants and break that down even further. So have those sheets ready and in your arsenal should you need to break that down a little further, or to let your department heads in this do that. Make sure you have people in there that know what they're doing and can reasonably get those tasks performed, so you can take that off your plate and not have to deal with it. So daily progression forms are another form that's easy to use. Now, these are more to give people their daily assignments that you have. So let's say in this one, the task is, the first task in the blank would be finish set up deskant dehumidifiers. So that is the task that should be performed by ABC Restoration. The person responsible is Jimmy Smith. And now we're going to estimate the start and completion of that task. That's either going to be with a time or maybe a date. But these are projections to shoot at. You're going to share these in your summaries. You're going to share them in your meetings. And you're going to share them when you talk to your department heads about how you're going to proceed with that day and the next day. You may actually fill these out the day before for the next day's assignment, so when everybody shows up, they know exactly what their progression steps should be on that day and how far along that they should get. So, all right, let's get started on scoping the job. I want you to notice that the scope is not about pricing. Scope and price are completely 2 separate items. You should not confuse the 2. The scope of work is to show you what you're going to do. You're going to do A, B, C. Say on a water damage job, your scope of work is to extract water. Your scope of work is to set air movers. Your scope of work is to provide dehumidification and a description of what the dehumidification is. And then let's say you get started with that, because on the first day, that may be all that you know that your scope of work is. And this scope of work is going to grow as you go. So they are completely separate. They are different, and make sure you don't confuse the 2. Now, you obviously have to have a scope of work before you can start to get price together, because you have to know what you're going to do and to what you're going to charge for, and then what you actually did do. If you're following the IICRC guidelines, you also have to have a drying plan. So on your scope of work, you may want to have scope of work / drying plan, because the book says you must have a drying plan. Sometimes that is confused with the scope of work. The only difference between your scope on a small building and a large building is the time it takes to put it out. In the beginning day or two, you can keep your scope generalized, as I spoke about a while ago. We're going to extract water, we're going to set up air movement, we're going to set up dehumidification, we're going to do testing for asbestos materials. That's on every job, by the way. We're going to make sure that debris is picked up. We're going to talk about contents manipulation and what you got to do with that. But to get a detailed and fine scope, you're going to have a sketch of the building. Now, sometimes that takes a long time. Sometimes we use a fire escape plan like in a hotel, but it'll show the room, but it don't show the bathrooms, it don't show the kitchen. It actually just has a block of the size of the room that's not to scale, and it shows people how to get out in case of a fire. So you can start with that, but when you start to do your detailed scope, then that will not necessarily be the sketch that you'll be able to use. So you've got to get that sketch. So you go back to your task assignment report, and you would need somebody in charge of creating that sketch. Now, there are different tools to create a sketch. Some people like to use Matterport, and Matterport will create the sketch for you. That's the more high-tech way these days of doing it. It also provides for excellent documentation when you're doing the, because you got photo documentation, you've actually got something that you can go through the structure and sort of walk through it, if you will, and look around as you go. If you're not familiar with Matterport, it's just a 3D camera that you take of the entire building, and then you can actually take your mouse on a computer and follow the 3D camera and look around in a room at a 360-degree view, both vertically and horizontally. A lot like real estate companies use, showing virtual plans for homes that are for sale. It's a great tool. It saves many trips to the job to go look at stuff. You can simply pull it up on your Matterport and look at it. However, some of your more basic ways of doing sketch are just doing your physical tape measuring and drawing it on scale paper, putting it on Xactimate, or some other type sketch program that you want to use. But to get a detailed scope, you will need that. But in the beginning, your narrow scope will work. How long does it take to scope a large loss? We can do the initial scope on a large loss, and you should be able to do your initial scope on a large loss within 10 to 15 minutes of arriving on the job site, assuming you're not flogged by 400 people asking 600 questions, that is. But your initial scope on the water damage would be extract water, prepare for equipment arrival, set air movement, dehumidification equipment, maybe pick up some debris or move some contents around. And then the last line would say a more detailed scope will follow once we've assessed the loss more thoroughly. And then don't forget to do that. Your most important thing about getting paid on a large loss job is having a detailed scope and a detailed contract that includes the scope of work, because if you don't get authorization to do it, then you may not get paid for doing that. So your initial scope takes very little time, and your scope will grow as it goes. I like to say do it by taking baby steps. Don't try to go in and scope an entire job before you get your contract started. Just go in and start taking your little baby steps and do a little bit at a time, and the scope will grow every day. So the question comes back, should I include build back with the mitigation scope? Absolutely not. The two, just as pricing and scope are completely separate, build back and mitigation are completely separate. Now, will you have the customer every now and then that wants 100% total price before you start? Yes, but that's very vague. I mean, you are very unusual. You normally will not have that to happen. Normally, they're interested in doing mitigation, which means stop further damage from occurring, to get the situation under control, and then let's back up and look at it together. You should have a separate contract for mitigation, just as you have a separate contract for rebuild. You're more than likely on rebuild going to get an agreed to scope with everybody involved, that being the person you're working for involved, and he agrees to the scope of work. They may or may not wish you to involve insurance consultants and adjusters in agreeing to that scope. Most of the time they do want them involved. So when you get to talking about build back, make sure that you analyze that and make sure how you want to do that. Usually the ball slows down a little bit on build back. You get an agreed to scope. A lot of times you'll get an agreed to pricing before build back gets started. We don't always have that luxury on mitigation. So keep those two separate, and we can worry about build back after we get the mitigation under control and get that well underway. So go through your scope one item at a time. Just follow the progression of the job. It's the easiest way. The first thing you're going to do is mobilization. Now, most of the time you've already done that when you start writing this up. The second thing you're going to do is water extraction and debris removal of anything that may have fallen or collapsed into the floor. The next thing you're going to do is start some thermal imaging. I don't recommend getting a map down and trying to draw a detailed map on the first couple of hours you're on the job. That can be done the next day. When you've got more people there, you've got equipment set, but for your initial placement of equipment, go through this in baby steps and go into progression. You're going to do the job. So then once you run through it with the thermal imaging camera and you start to find out where the walls are wet, where the floors are wet, where the ceiling's wet, then you can start your equipment placement. Then you're going to do equipment placement mapping. That won't necessarily be done on the first day either. Once you do your equipment placement and get your equipment connected and turned on, now you've stopped further damage to the building. Now you can back up and fill in some of these steps, such as equipment placement maps on the interior. If you want to do that, you can back up and let's say you may need to pull baseboards on the second or third day to drill some holes in the wall after asbestos testings come back, et cetera, et cetera. So this scope does not all have to be done on the first day. I've seen a lot of people lose a lot of jobs by trying to go in and scope and price the entire mitigation project before they get started. And you've got a customer over here pulling their hair out, wanting to see something get started, and you're trying to get the paperwork done. So keep your scopes small and narrow in the beginning, with the bottom line always saying the scope will continue to grow and it will get larger as we go, and you will keep everybody updated with a continuing scope each day. You see over on the right, the elephant, the old saying, eat this elephant one bite at a time. Nobody can eat the whole elephant in one setting. Your customer, look at it through your customer's eyeglass, is the very person that you cannot feed all that information to in one setting. They want one thing. They want their building back like it was before the damage. Now, that is not a very good scope if you just write that one line item on your scope. You've got to write how you're going to do that and how you're going to put that stuff uh, back together, how you're going to stop further damage, how you're going to do mitigation, and then what's the plan of putting it back together. Within that scope, you may have to do mitigation while they're in business. A lot of people want to come in and say, clear the building out and we'll do the job. It's not always feasible. Nursing homes, hospitals, places like that that have residents in them, they're really difficult to work around, but you've got to put together a scope of work to provide working around that and have people in charge of making sure that that is carried out. So scope of work, and you notice underneath this in this slide, it has the words drying plan. Again, the ICRC says you must have a drying plan. If you've got in your contract or in your work authorization or your agreement with the customer that you're going to follow guidelines as set forth by industry standards or the ICRC or anything like that, then you need the word drying plans on this. In this particular scope of work, you've got, of course, the customer's name and the project name and address, and then you see the little blank line starting. And it says the following scope of work is agreed upon. Now, you don't need to reinvent the wheel on every single drying job. A lot of you that's used to using programs that estimate work for you have what you call macros. And, on a water damage job, you'll have certain macros that are already set up to do the job. Well, your scope of work is pretty much the same as that, is you don't need to create a new scope of work for every water damage job. You need to have macros, or what we call boilerplate scopes of work. And we're going to show an example of a boilerplate scope of work in a minute. But let's say before you get to that point that you're setting up the scope, the owner tells you that the adjuster's coming in and he wants to talk about the job. Now, normally adjusters will come in. The first adjuster that gets there on a large loss will not be able to handle the large loss. He's a first strike guy that they have sent out to evaluate it and tell them how large it's going to be, and to take initial photos, hopefully before you've done too much in his eyes, to give them an initial plan. They've even started calling these guys inspectors instead of adjusters, or instead of claims reps. They're going to send an inspector out to look at it, take photos, and you'll normally get somebody else. But when you have an inspector or an adjuster out there and the owner has asked you to coordinate with them on his behalf, don't become a public adjuster. But obviously, if you can agree to the scope of work and change your scope as they come in, that's usually an advantage. Sometimes they don't want the scope of work to be what it is, but you may need and may have to involve these people when you're doing some parts of your scope of work. You wouldn't want to go in and do complete demolition on a huge building and then find out that the adjuster's idea was to dry everything in place, and now they're not paying for the demolition. And oh, by the way, we probably want you to pay for putting all that back together as well. So a 5-minute conversation up front and documentation to follow that up will solve that problem. Another thing that always comes up with the adjuster is, should I help the adjuster set reserves? That's a question for you and your company to answer. There's two mindsets on this. One mindset is, yes, you do everything you can to help that adjuster set reserves. You give him some numbers. You let him know where you think you're going to be at on that. The other mindset is, that is the adjuster's job. It's not your job to do pricing on the first day or two, and that you can give the adjuster what numbers you have available, what information you have available, and let him set his own reserves. So however you want to do that is a company decision on how you do that, and it may vary from time to time. You may have one insurance company or one adjuster that you've worked with before, and you're comfortable doing that. The devil in the details with this is the adjuster needs to be within 10% plus or minus on his reserve for the entire job. And if you're wrong either way, he's not going to be real happy about it, as his bosses will not be real happy with him. So if you want to stay clear of that and let him do it, one practice that a lot of folks take is to give them a daily burn rate. So you've probably been there 2 or 3 days by the time the adjuster gets there. And you should have had time to put together some numbers. Again, you've got a different person on the task assignment form doing that for you, because that's not something you have time to do if you're in charge. But you've had them putting together numbers, and by the 3rd day, you should have a pretty good idea of what your burn rate each day is. About how much am I billing out each day? Your first day is mobilization. That's going to be a little lopsided because that's usually expensive, depending on how far you're traveling. Your second day is pretty chaotic because you're getting everything lined up and put together and trying to figure out, how big the building is and getting your sketch done and this, that, and the other, sort of like the slide with the street signs going in it. By your 3rd day, you should be a little bit in calmer waters. Things should leveled out a little bit. And your 3rd day should give you a true idea of what your burn rate should be. And then you should also have an estimate on how long you think the mitigation portion of the job will last. So let's say your burn rate's 10,000 a day and you think you're going to probably be there 10 days, then it might not be too bad to say, we're going to be somewhere in the ballpark of 100,000. Now, if you're going to step out on that plank and do that, I recommend ranges. So in that scenario, I may say, I think we're going to be between 80,000 and 120,000, somewhere in that ballpark. To give a ballpark range, it gives yourself a little out. Or you can do what some companies do and just say, hey, let me give you all the information I can and let me leave setting the reserves to you, because you do that every day. You know how to do that very well. So that's the spiel about reserves and ideas about that. What about not to exceed, NTEs? You hear that. An adjuster or consultant say, well, I need an NTE. And you might want to do a not to exceed. I think it's the worst contract you can have in the world. You're setting a price with somebody that you promise you won't go over it. And I will promise you, by the time they ask for that not to exceed, you have not even completed the scope of work. In a lot of these commercial buildings, you hadn't found all the rooms in the building yet. There are hidden rooms here and there, and you'll open the door and find stuff you absolutely had no idea you were going to run into. You don't know how thick the sheetrock is and how many walls you've got that's got wallpaper behind this finish or that finish or the other finish. How much demo is going to have to be done, but yet you're going to try to look at a thumbnail sketch and give somebody a not to exceed. I think that's a very slippery slope. It's very dangerous, but it gives the building owner, and if that's coming from the insured, it's giving them a ceiling from which to work down from. You cannot exceed a not to exceed number. So they know that's their highest number. Now we'll see how low they can get the price that is below that number. It's not a good recommendation. I don't think it's a good way of doing business on large commercial jobs. If you miss one on Miss Jones's house and you miss it by 10%, that 10% may be $3,000. It's not a big deal. But let's say you miss one on a commercial project and that 10% equals $30,000 or maybe even $300,000, then it might become a big deal. So be careful with not to exceeds. What about bid contracts for mitigation? Again, if you're very well experienced in large loss mitigation and you want to roll up on a job and say, well, if you just want to bid, I'll do this for $649,018.18, then you can do that. It is a hard number to come up with. You'll always get beat up if the number is too high, and they will ask you to come down. Again, most times in this, you don't even know what the scope of work is yet. You don't know how detailed that's going to be. You may or may not know at this point whether you're dealing with asbestos or not. So it's a slippery slope. There are some companies, and it used to be pretty common to do the drying part of a job by square foot pricing. But that scope of drying was limited. It was limited to air movement, dehumidification, and the setup of those things. And for that, you would do it at X dollars and cents per square foot for the initial drying. If you're experienced in that area and can do that, that's one way of giving a contract bid on the drying. I would stop short of offering that on demolition and clean up after the demolition and all that, because once again, when you're asked this question, the scope is going to be growing or shrinking, one or the other, every day. It's going to change, and you don't have all those answers yet, so it's hard to come up with that pricing scenario. Adjustments to the scope. When do you make adjustments to the scope? You're going to make adjustments to the scope on a larger loss job almost every day. You're going to find stuff that you didn't know was there. You're going to find that the sheetrock wall you're looking at that you thought you were going to inject a couple of holes in and dry has concrete blocks behind it. And those concrete blocks may be full of water. You don't know that on day 1, 2, or 3. Sometimes you don't even do destructive testing until the 3rd or 4th day when you have a problem with an area. You may think on day 1 or 2 that you've got a single layer of sheetrock in the hallway. And then you may find out that's a 1-hour fire-rated wall that has 2 layers. You may find out on the 2nd or 3rd day that that sheetrock is what they call green board or MR board, standing for moisture resistant. Well, if it's moisture resistant for water to get into, it will also be moisture resistant for water to get out of, and that makes it much harder to dry. So as you go, you're going to have to adjust your scope and fine tune that every day. Now, when you adjust your scope and it's not in the original scope, you need to adjust your scope, but then you need a change order for the adjusted scope. If you don't have a change order on a job, whether that be by email or written, and different states have different laws about that, about how you have to do that. So know the laws in your state, or know the laws in the state that your contracts are governed by, one or the other. But a written change order is always the safest. A lot of times we do small change orders by email, just advise, everybody what we're going to do or how we're going to do it. But make sure at any rate that you do have a change order that reflects your scope on there and what is changed on that scope, unless it's covered in your original scope of work. The more detailed your scope is, the easier it will be to get paid when there is a discussion about whether or not you're going to get paid for something. And notice I said when there is, not if there is. I have been doing this, as the previous slide showed, over 40 years. I've had one adjuster, only one in my entire career, adjust a job upwards. They're called adjusters because they will take whatever you give them, and their job is to adjust that down and to try to get it a little cheaper. On program work, if you're following all the rules and you're following all the regulations, it may be across the board. You may get some jobs in to where there's not any adjustment up or down. It may just be level across the board. But when you're not dealing with program work, it most always is going to be adjustments on the paperwork that you turn in, or an attempt to make adjustments on that. So be careful with change orders. Make sure that you do them. If it's not written in your contract or in your scope of work, no one has authorized you to do that. I don't care what they say and how many meetings they say it in. If it's not authorized in your contract or in your scope of work, you need to assume that you will not get paid for it. So change orders, scope of work, your best friend when it comes to getting paid. Documentation and communication is the key to successful conclusions. And you'll see in the little slide here, it says, write what you know. And then I cross it out and it says, write what you do. Okay, you need to document everything that's done. Not documenting things you know or things they know. You need to document 3 things: what you did yesterday, what you're doing today, what you plan on doing tomorrow. And that needs documented, but you can document everything in the world and throw it in the file. But if you don't communicate that in a timely fashion, then what good does it do? You're the only one that knows it. Sort of like you going to the doctor and you've got a serious illness and the doctor knows that and he documents it and puts it in the file, but he never walks in the room and tells you that you have a serious illness. It would be the same principle as you documenting stuff that's going on a job site, but you're not communicating it with the building owner or the building management. Now, in a lot of cases, and in most cases, the building owner or the building management will ask you to also copy that copy your information to the adjuster or the adjuster's consultant or the insurance agent or other key people. And if they ask you to do that, you always send your information to the building owner or management, whoever signed your contract, i.e., and then you copy it to anybody they've asked you to copy it to, so they can participate in the information that's going around. Again, sometimes that's done through email, sometimes that's done through Dropbox and other different avenues. Your key information, such as change orders and scope and contracts and all, should, even if you put it on Dropbox or Job Docs or Communication Pro or any of the programs you got, should also be emailed so you can have a chain of custody when you know they open those emails and read them, or in some cases if they should have opened the emails and read them. So documentation and communication are key when it comes through that. The scope starts when the call comes in. As soon as the phone rings, they're going to give you information about something. So you're going to have a generalized knowledge of what part of your scope is going to be. Again, have those boilerplated in there for your water and fire. Every water damage, you're going to set air movement. Every water damage, you're going to set dehumidification. Every water damage, you're going to extract water if necessary. So it's a lot of things in the scope that you can already have assigned and in there. Your scope ends. It starts when the phone rings. It ends when the completion certificate's signed. So you're through with the mitigation. You've got that done. You're going to give the customer a certificate stating that his building is dry, and your completion certificate for the mitigation portion is signed. That is when your scope is complete, and you can quit revising that scope. But other than that, things will change each day. Scope is the most important key to getting paid, but it is not the only key. It's like saying a car is the most important way to get down the road, but a car with no gas will not get you down the road. A car with no tires will not get you down the road. So scope is one of the most important keys, but if you don't have the other supporting things around it, it won't get you to where you're going, which is getting the customer back to the place where they can be in business and getting the check into your bank. That concludes our presentation today on scoping jobs and the communication that goes around that. I hope the presentation has been of good use to you. I'm available by phone for any questions that you might have, and feel free to give me a call at any time. This is a presentation by the CREST Network, which I know you're familiar with. CREST is Commercial Restoration, Education, and Support Training. It is not a one-time training class or one-time seminar, but rather a support group to help you from start to beginning to become successful in the commercial restoration business. I'm Scott Tarpley. Thank you for your attendance. Have a blessed day. Thank you.